My name's Helen Steadman. I'm a historical novelist with Impress Books. I've written 3 novels so far: Widdershins, its sequel Sunwise, and my newest book, The Running Wolf. The international rights for all 3 books are available, and if anyone is interested, I'll share contact details at the end of this film. First though, I'd like to say a little bit about all 3 books and about the research I carried out. I'll start with the newest book first, The Running Wolf. The Running Wolf is set partially in Germany and partially in England. It starts in 1687 in Solingen in northwest Germany, when a group of 20 swordmakers defect from Germany and move to the northeast of England, to a small village called Shotley Bridge. They live there quite peacefully for some time, and there's a lot of mystery concerning the swordmakers. But what is known is that one of their number, Hermann Mohll, returned to Germany, and we know this because he was found on his return to England smuggling 1,400 swords. For this, he was put in prison. But there's more to the case than meets the eye. It wasn't a straightforward case of smuggling. He was suspected of working in cahoots with the Jacobites. A number of very powerful and influential people were involved in his case, all the way up to Queen Anne and her right-hand man, the Earl of Nottingham. Eventually, Hermann Mohll was released. However, it seems that even though he was freed, he was guilty of high treason, because the man who was in charge of his trial, Justice Henry Villiers, was later found guilty himself of smuggling, and he was working hand in glove with a famous Jacobite from Aberdeen in Scotland called Captain Thomas Gordon. And while I was researching for the book, I found quite an interesting cache of documents which had never been considered in any of the existing books about the swordmakers. While I was researching about the swordmakers, I found a lot of court documents, which of course everybody had seen, but there were lots of gaps in them and lots of unanswered questions. So I thought these documents have got to be somewhere. So like a detective, I followed the trail, and eventually I uncovered some new evidence that had not been considered in any of the many non-fiction books about the swordmakers. And these documents, many of which were letters written by the Earl of Nottingham on behalf of Queen Anne, these letters reveal quite a few interesting things about the case. The most interesting of all, I think, is that Queen Anne left it up to the local justice in charge of the trial to decide whether or not Hermann Mohll was guilty of treason or not. And then Hermann Mohll was released from prison at the hands of Justice Henry Villiers. But shortly after the trial, Henry Villiers himself was put in the dock and found guilty on 2 counts of smuggling, and he was fined over £500. And for context, his yearly salary for being governor of Tynemouth Castle was £70 a year, so this was quite an enormous fine. It took 15 minutes to find him guilty. So it looks very much that Hermann Mohll was in fact smuggling swords for the Jacobites, and that he was helped in that by Justice Henry Villiers, but he got away with it. Henry Villiers, of course, didn't get away with it. These are really interesting findings, and they've been published in a Taylor and Francis academic journal called Northern History. And if anybody is interested in reading those findings, if you look on my website, helensteadman.com, you'll find information on there. I'd like to say a few words about my first novel, Widdershins, which means anti-clockwise. It's a word associated with the occult and the devil. This is based on the Newcastle witch trials, which took place in 1650. They're not very well known about outside Newcastle, And that's quite strange because it was the biggest mass execution on a single day of witches, and on English soil at any rate. And 15 women and 1 man were hanged on the town moor, and in itself that is unusual. So that indicates that it was some kind of huge festive day for the local people in Newcastle. While I was writing this book, I did a lot of research into witches and witchfinders, and one of the things that I did was I carried out training in herbal medicine, just to help me to get underneath the characters of the various healers that appear in Widdershins. So I went to a place in Northumberland called Dilston Physic Garden, and I trained in tree medicine. So I learned to identify trees and plants, and then I harvested bark, leaves, berries, flowers, and I made lots of different remedies, including things like elder linctus, which you'll see crop up in Widdershins throughout. And I feel this approach helped me to make sure my characters were authentic and that the details of the herbal medicine were authentic. And I carried this kind of research on into my sword making book, and I did some blacksmithing training, which culminated in making a sword. So I too am a sword maker. Not a very good one, it has to be said. What I also did for this book was to look deeply into the Witchfinder, because I was very interested to see what motivated people to do these terrible things to women, because it was mainly women who were executed for witchcraft, although obviously there were some men. So what I did was look at very well-known witchfinders like Matthew Hopkins, who was the Witchfinder General in England, and also some witchfinders in Scotland, so John Kincaid, people like him. And I looked at their own depositions, things they'd said about themselves and why they did what they did. And there were some very interesting ideas and suggestions that came to me. So all of these have been fused into the character of John Sharp, who is the Witchfinder in Widdershins. Sunwise is the sequel to Widdershins. It picks up where Widdershins left off in August 1650, which is straight after the mass hanging of the witches. And it concludes a year later, so it's a much shorter space of time and much faster. And it's told in the dual perspective of Jane, who is the suspected witch, and John, who is the witchfinder. So it continues the story through to its conclusion. And this just shows how John Sharp has moved from a general hatred of women and witches to blaming this one specific woman. So all of his hatred and anger is focused on this one woman, who ultimately he destroys. The community, however, finally come to their senses and they wreak their revenge on John Sharp, so he doesn't get away with it. And this is based on what happened to a man who was suspected of being the real Newcastle witchfinder, in that he was let escape, even though the authorities knew that he was a fraud. They let him go, but eventually he was caught up with in Scotland and put to death. And before he was executed, he confessed to falsely accusing over 200 women who were then sent to their deaths. So I thought I would give the choice of justice to the community, and they burnt him to death quite horribly. This wasn't a novel I ever planned to write, strangely enough. I'd written Widdershins and I thought that was the end of the book. And then when I was supposed to be writing The Running Wolf about the German Swordmakers, this book just started to write itself. So I kept going, and here it is. So the characters have been put to rest now. Jane is dead and John Sharp is dead. So there will be no further books in that series, I think. Thank you very much for coming along. I hope you found something to interest you. If you want to know more about witches, witchfinders, herbal medicines, sword makers, Jacobites, folklore, then come along to my website and have a look on the blog, helensteadman.com. There are lots of useful articles and resources and further reading for you there. If anybody is interested in the rights to any of my books, please contact Geoffrey Collier at Impress Books and he will be able to give you more information. Thank you for your time and I hope you enjoy the rest of the festival. Goodbye.